Right after losing his wife, a grieving father thought he had at least one small comfort left, but his own son delivered the cruelest blow. The garage that once held a treasured dream car, a symbol of decades of sacrifice, stood empty. And when confronted, the son coldly admitted he had sold it not for survival, not for family, but to fund his wife's luxury trip. The betrayal cut deeper than any grave-turning sorrow into silent rage. Don't forget to subscribe and comment where you're watching from, because what happened next will make you question everything about loyalty and blood. The house felt enormous, every corner humming with a silence that pressed against his chest. After the funeral, after the crowd of neighbors, casseroles, and hollow condolences, the emptiness set in like a second skin. Richard, a father in his late 60s, walked through the hallways at night with the lights off, letting the glow of street lamps slip across framed photographs on the walls. In each picture, his late wife Margaret seemed to look back at him with that soft half-smile, as though she knew he would struggle in her absence. He ran his fingers over the wood grain of the banister, remembering how she used to pause there to fix her hair before stepping out. Now the house was only him, his breathing, and the ticking of a grandfather clock that had grown louder since her passing. The loneliness was not the quiet kind. It was active, invasive. It crept into his sleep, stole the taste of his morning coffee, and filled the kitchen with a weight heavier than grief itself. He tried to keep busy polishing the hardwood floors, dusting the blinds, even fixing a loose tile in the kitchen that Margaret had complained about for years. Yet every task reminded him of her voice, her touch, her laughter echoing through the rooms. When he sat down at night with the television on, the sound of commercials rattling across the living room, he realized he wasn't watching, only waiting for what he didn't know. The only anchor he had left was in the garage. Behind the heavy steel door rested his pride, a car he had rebuilt over 20 years of sweat and patience. That machine was more than metal. It was memory. He could still see himself and Margaret on a summer evening years ago, her holding the flashlight while he tightened bolts, teasing him for swearing when the wrench slipped. She called the car his second marriage, but there had been warmth in her eyes when she said it. Every weekend since her passing, he found himself wiping down its hood, adjusting parts that didn't need adjusting, sitting behind the wheel as though waiting for her to climb into the passenger seat again. But Richard was not blind. He noticed the absence of phone calls, the hollow words when his son Kevin did bother to check in. Kevin spoke like a stranger, rushed, distracted, always ending conversations with excuses about meetings his wife Madison or their child's soccer practice. Richard never demanded attention. Fathers of his generation rarely did. Yet he felt the gap widening, an invisible canyon between them. On a Tuesday evening, while the sky outside turned lavender, Richard opened the garage door, expecting to see that gleaming shape waiting for him. Instead, he found only dust swirling in the air, the concrete bare and absent, so sharp it nearly cut him in two. For a moment, he thought he had entered the wrong house. He blinked hard, his hand trembling on the doorframe. The car was gone. Hours later, Kevin arrived, his face calm, casual, as though nothing monumental had shifted. He stood in the kitchen, sipping a soda, not even meeting his father's eyes when he spoke. "I sold it, Dad. You don't need it anymore. It's just sitting there collecting dust." Richard's pulse throbbed in his temples. His voice came out low, deliberate. "You sold my car?" Kevin shrugged. "It's not a big deal. We needed the money. Madison's parents are celebrating their anniversary, and we planned something special. A trip. First class, Europe. They deserve it." The words landed heavier than bricks. Richard stared at his son, at the same boy he once carried on his shoulders, the boy who learned to ride a bike in the driveway, the boy who sat in the passenger seat of that very car, learning how to drive. Now that boy was gone, replaced by a man who spoke of family only when it meant his in-laws. Richard didn't shout. The rage came cold, sliding through his veins like ice water. He turned, walked to the window, and stared into the night. His reflection in the glass was not the man he remembered. His shoulders hunched, his hair thinning, his eyes shadowed. He whispered not to Kevin, but to himself, "You'll never forget this day." That night the house felt colder than ever. He sat in his study, the smell of old books and leather chairs surrounding him, the silence broken only by the hum of the refrigerator down the hall. He took out a notepad and began writing not a plan, but fragments, dates, numbers, reminders. Each note was a piece of a puzzle only he could see. He wasn't going to beg for his car back. He wasn't going to argue about betrayal. He was going to show his son a lesson that would echo through generations. Over the next days, Richard's phone lit up with texts from Kevin, request reminders, even jokes about how Madison's parents were thrilled with their gift. Richard responded with brief acknowledgments, never letting his hand reveal the cards he now held. He spoke less, listened more, and paid attention to the cracks in his son's words. Kevin was careless with money. The trip had drained more than just the proceeds of the car. There were credit cards, loans, whispers of debt. Richard began gathering old contacts, friends from his construction days, a lawyer he hadn't spoken to in years, even the local mechanic who once helped him restore the car's engine. He learned, he noted, he prepared. Each evening he sat in the dim glow of his desk lamp, piecing together a path toward something Kevin would never see coming. And yet, as he moved through this quiet storm of preparation, the loneliness remained. At night he lay awake, listening to the distant sound of a freight train passing through town, the whistle echoing in the dark. He thought of Margaret, of how she would have handled this. She would have spoken softly, urged him not to harden his heart. But Richard knew this wasn't about bitterness. It was about justice. It was about reclaiming dignity from the hands of a son who had forgotten what blood and loyalty meant. He poured himself a glass of bourbon one night, the amber liquid catching the light, and whispered into the stillness of the house, "You thought you erased me, Kevin, but you only woke me up." Outside, the wind pressed against the windows, carrying the smell of rain. Inside, Richard leaned back in his chair, his notes spread out before him, his plan sharpening like a blade. The silence of the house was no longer suffocating. It was waiting. It was holding its breath, preparing for what was to come. And when it came, it would not be loud. It would not be messy. It would be precise, unforgettable, and final. Because betrayal like this did not fade. It carved itself into the bone, and only one thing could balance the scales. What Richard set in motion after that night would not just reclaim what was his. It would tear down the very illusion Kevin lived in piece by piece, until the son who thought he held the upper hand realized he had built his life on a foundation that could be shaken with a single push. The house, once a monument to loss, now became a fortress. Each room held secrets, each memory sharpened into resolve. Richard walked through the halls no longer as a grieving widower, but as a man with purpose. And though Kevin believed the betrayal was done, the truth was far more dangerous, because Richard wasn't finished. He was only beginning. In the dim glow of the single overhead bulb, the garage became the only place where Richard felt whole. The car sat there like a monument, polished to a sheen that caught the light and threw it back with quiet defiance. Every curve, every line of chrome, every carefully stitched detail inside had passed through his hands. He had poured 2 decades of his life into restoring it, scraping together money when there wasn't much to spare, scouring junkyards for rare parts, bargaining with mechanics, and teaching himself through manuals yellowed by time. That car wasn't just a machine, it was his history in steel and leather, the one thing that had never betrayed him. He could remember the first time he turned the key after the rebuild, the engine roaring alive, Margaret standing nearby with a hand pressed to her lips. She had laughed then, the sound ringing brighter than the headlights piercing the dusk. They had taken it for a drive down the open highway, the wind tearing through their hair, and for that hour life had felt infinite. Now after she was gone, the car was more than memory. It was sanctuary. Sitting behind the wheel, he felt her hand ghosting against his arm, her laughter brushing against his ear. It was as if she still rode with him, a presence that made the silence bearable. Sometimes he spent hours in the garage without even starting the engine. He would simply sit, eyes closed, one hand gripping the wheel, the smell of leather and motor oil surrounding him like a second skin. The rest of the house felt like a mausoleum. But here, he was alive. The photographs on the wall could fade, the laughter could disappear, but the car was real, tangible, and it carried the weight of every sacrifice he had made. But even sanctuaries can be threatened. Richard had begun to notice subtle signs, careless remarks from Kevin, when he did visit glances from Madison when she walked past the garage door. They spoke of wasted space and old projects. They thought he didn't hear, but he did. Madison once made a joke at the dinner table saying the car looked like something destined for a scrapyard, not a driveway. Kevin had laughed, not with cruelty exactly, but with that dismissive tone that cut deeper than words. Richard had swallowed the sting, telling himself they didn't understand, but deep down he knew understanding wasn't the problem. It was respect. That respect had vanished somewhere along the years, replaced by entitlement dressed as concern. Kevin didn't see the car as a monument, a link to his mother, a reminder of the man who had raised him. He saw it as property. He saw it as numbers on a page, dollars waiting to be spent. Richard had watched him skim real estate listings late at night, heard him talk about opportunities with Madison's parents, conversations about vacations, renovations, investments. And every time the subject of money came up, Richard felt their eyes flicker toward him, toward what he owned, what he had built. One evening, Richard found himself tracing the car's body with his palm, following the cool line of metal, as though reassuring himself it was still there. He whispered under his breath, though no one could hear him, "You're all I have left." The hum of silence answered him, broken only by the faint creak of the house settling above. He stayed longer that night, lost in thought, until the garage grew colder and the light overhead flickered. He finally stepped back, locking the door behind him, but as he climbed the stairs, an unease gnawed at him. He could almost feel the threads of his life being tugged by unseen hands, unraveling faster than he could mend them. The next morning, the garage became his first stop. The car gleamed under the light, waiting a loyal companion. He brewed his coffee and drank it, leaning against the hood, staring at the world outside through the half-open door. The neighborhood was quiet, just the sound of a lawnmower down the street and a dog barking at passing cars. But Richard's gaze wasn't on the neighborhood, it was inward into memories he couldn't shake. He thought of Kevin at 10 years old, sitting on the passenger seat, wide-eyed and eager as he learned how to work the clutch. He thought of the pride in his son's face when he managed to drive a straight line in the empty parking lot, Richard's hand hovering near the wheel just in case. That pride had been real once. What had hollowed it out? The question haunted him. He wanted to believe Kevin was still that boy, still capable of loyalty, of understanding what mattered. But Madison's influence loomed large, her family's world of polished appearances and expensive tastes pressing down on everything. Richard had seen it before, the way she corrected Kevin's words in conversation, the way she planned every detail of their lives as though she were staging a production. And Kevin followed a willing actor, forgetting the script his father had once written for him in sweat and sacrifice. Days bled into weeks, and Richard's routine became a ritual. Morning coffee by the car, evenings spent in the garage adjusting details no one else would notice. He cleaned the leather seats until they shone, tightened bolts that didn't need tightening, cataloged every part as if preparing for something he couldn't name. It gave him purpose, a rhythm, and in those moments he convinced himself the car was untouchable, that it would always be there waiting for him. But fate has a way of striking when vigilance wanes. Richard had been away one afternoon picking up groceries and stopping at the hardware store for a new set of tools. When he returned, bags in hand, he walked into the garage without even glancing up until he did. The space was empty. The car, his monument, his sanctuary, was gone. His heart thudded in his chest, the bag slipping from his hands and spilling across the floor. For a long, suffocating moment, he couldn't breathe. He staggered forward, touching the bare concrete as though the car might suddenly reappear if he reached far enough. The silence mocked him. His pulse roared in his ears. That night Kevin arrived, his voice casual, his words sharp in their indifference. The betrayal landed heavier than any blow Richard had ever endured. Yet he didn't shout, didn't lash out. He absorbed the cruelty in silence, his rage coiling deep, silent but alive. And as he sat later in his study staring at the dark window, the bourbon glass trembling in his hand, one thought burned steady in his mind. The car may have been stolen from him, but something far greater had just been unleashed. What Richard began planning in that moment would not simply reclaim what was lost. It would dismantle the illusion his son lived under piece by piece until every lie crumbled. Because what Kevin had taken wasn't just a car. It was the last tether to a father's love, and tearing it away had consequences no one in that family could foresee. Richard clung to a fragile belief, one that flickered like a candle in the wind. He told himself that Kevin, for all his distance, would never forget what that car meant. After all, it had been Richard who placed his son's small hands on the wheel for the first time. He remembered that summer evening, the empty parking lot at the high school, the asphalt still warm under the fading sun. Kevin had been nervous, his knuckles white against the steering wheel, but Richard had guided him patiently, his voice calm, steady, instructing him on the clutch, the brake, the rhythm of machine and man. When Kevin finally eased the car into motion, the boys' laughter had burst out loud and unrestrained, and Richard had laughed too, the sound filling the air between them. That memory had stayed with him, a golden moment, where father and son shared something pure, something unshakable. Surely, he thought, no one forgets that kind of bond. He carried that hope like armor, convincing himself that Kevin's indifference was temporary, that it was the weight of work, of adulthood, of marriage. Richard excused the curt replies to his calls, the distracted looks, the conversations that seemed more like transactions. He reminded himself of the boy who once begged to sit in the garage just to hand his father tools, eager to learn the language of engines, of patience, of grit. He wanted to believe that boy still existed beneath the polished exterior Madison demanded, beneath the shallow smiles and the ambition that seemed to gnaw at him day by day. But even as he held on to that hope, Richard saw cracks forming. At a family gathering, Kevin barely glanced at the car parked proudly in the driveway. Richard had waited for a comment, some acknowledgement, but all he received was a dismissive wave of the hand as Kevin steered the conversation toward vacation plans and real estate investments. Madison smiled tightly beside him, her eyes lingering on the car, not with affection, but with calculation. Richard caught that glance, a glimmer of appraisal, as though she were already imagining a price tag hanging from the rear-view mirror. Still, Richard tried. He invited Kevin into the garage one Saturday. Tools laid out, the hood open, the smell of oil and polish filling the air. "Remember when we rebuilt the transmission together?" Richard asked, his voice carrying a softness that surprised even him. Kevin had smiled faintly, a flicker of memory passing over his face, but it vanished just as quickly. "Yeah, Dad. But I don't have time for that anymore. Life's different now." The words stung more than they should have. Richard had nodded, hiding the weight pressing against his chest. He tried to bridge the silence by showing him the latest adjustment he'd made, the meticulous care he'd taken. Kevin only glanced at his watch and said he had to leave. The door shut behind him and the garage returned to silence, the kind that pressed down like a verdict. Yet Richard refused to let go of that sliver of belief. He told himself Kevin would come around, that maybe when the years caught up with him, when his own children grew older, he would remember the lessons his father had taught him. The patience of the open road, the pride of building something with your own hands. He convinced himself that betrayal was impossible, that blood carried memory, even when the heart faltered. One night, unable to sleep, Richard wandered into the garage and sat in the driver's seat. The clock read past midnight, the house quiet, the world outside still. He closed his eyes and imagined Kevin beside him, the boy he once knew, asking questions about gears, laughing when the engine roared. He whispered to the empty seat, "You'll understand one day. You'll see." The hope tasted bitter, but it was hope nonetheless. But the days that followed carried shadows. Kevin's visits grew rarer, his conversations colder. When he did speak of the car, it was in passing, in tones that made Richard uneasy. He remembered one call in particular, Kevin's voice, casual, almost careless. "You know, Dad, you don't drive that thing much anymore. It just sits there." Maybe it's time to let it go. Richard's grip on the phone had tightened his throat dry. He had forced a laugh, deflecting, changing the subject, but the words lingered long after the call ended. It was then Richard realized his hope was not armor at all. It was a thin veil, fragile and fraying, stretched too tightly over the reality pressing in. He saw the truth in Kevin's eyes when they met at dinner, the absence of reverence, the absence of connection. The boy who once grinned in the passenger seat was gone, replaced by a man who measured value in dollars and convenience, not in memory or sacrifice. Still, Richard clung to the possibility like a man holding the last rung of a ladder above a pit. He wanted to believe in redemption, in loyalty, in a bond that couldn't be severed. But deep down beneath the layers of denial, he knew the ladder was splintering. And when it broke, when Kevin's choice was laid bare, Richard would be forced to face a truth sharper than any blade that hope, no matter how cherished, can sometimes be the cruelest illusion of all. What happened next would prove it. Weeks passed, and the silence from Kevin began to stretch like a wire pulled too tight. Richard felt it in the smallest details: the absence of a phone call on Sunday morning, the lack of a photo from his grandson's birthday, the way every text Kevin sent now read like a business memo instead of a son reaching out to his father. Short clipped phrases: busy week, can't talk now, hope you're well. No warmth, no questions, no hint that he cared about what was happening in the old house or inside the man who had raised him. The words landed like cold coins dropped on a table, impersonal and hard. Richard noticed how his own replies became shorter too, as if the distance were contagious. He would sit at the kitchen table with his phone in his hand, staring at the blank screen long after sending a message, waiting for a reply that came hours later, or not at all. It wasn't just neglect. It was a slow erasure. Kevin wasn't merely busy. He was rewriting his father's role, reducing him from a man to an afterthought, from a voice to background noise. In the evenings, Richard wandered the house like a ghost. He stopped turning on the television, stopped making full meals. He ate standing up at the counter, a sandwich, a cup of coffee gone cold. The clock in the hallway ticked louder than before, the sound echoing through the emptiness. He had thought loneliness was at its worst after Margaret died, but this was a different kind of hollow, a living person choosing absence. The realization cut deeper than any funeral. The garage became his refuge, but even there he felt the echo of Kevin's absence. He would sit in the car and remember the boy who used to run into this space after school, dropping his backpack, eager to tinker with whatever project his father had laid out. Those afternoons had been filled with chatter and questions, the smell of motor oil mixing with Kevin's teenage cologne. Now the air smelled only of polish and solitude. Sometimes Richard tried to break the silence. He would send an invitation, a casual suggestion to stop by, to share a meal, to take a drive together. The responses, when they came, were polite excuses, each one a brick in a wall Kevin was building between them. Richard told himself to be patient, but patience felt like another word for surrender. He began to notice patterns in Kevin's absences. Whenever there was talk of money, property taxes, insurance, even small repairs, Kevin disappeared for longer stretches, only to resurface with a question that skirted around the edges of his father's assets. Do you really need the lake house anymore? Ever thought about selling the car? It's just sitting there. The questions were always framed as concern, but Richard heard what lay beneath. They weren't offers of help. They were tests, probes to see how far they could push. One afternoon, as Richard cleaned out a drawer in the garage, he found an old photograph tucked into a manual. Kevin at 16, holding up a wrench like a trophy, grease smudged across his forehead, grinning at the camera. Richard stared at it for a long time, his throat tightening. He slid the photo into his pocket, not sure why, but knowing he couldn't leave it there. It felt like a relic from a vanished world, proof that the boy he remembered had once been real. Nights grew longer. Richard began waking at 3 a.m., the house silent except for the wind pressing against the windows. He would sit in his study with a mug of black coffee, the bitterness grounding him as he scrolled through Kevin's old messages, reading between the lines. The coldness wasn't an accident. It was a decision. And if it was a decision, then it had a reason. He started noticing small inconsistencies. Kevin mentioning bills he shouldn't have vacations, he shouldn't afford a car he'd borrowed from Madison's father that he later hinted might become his permanently. Each clue was a piece of a puzzle Richard didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. The silence wasn't just neglect, it was camouflage. Kevin was hiding something and the distance was his cover. Richard felt a slow shift inside himself. The ache of abandonment hardened into something steadier, sharper. He stopped sending messages first. He stopped waiting for replies. He began observing instead, taking notes, building a quiet map of his son's behavior, the way a hunter tracks the movements of a deer through the forest. It wasn't revenge yet, but it was the blueprint of a man who had been forced to wake up. He also began to move his own pieces. Small, deliberate steps Kevin wouldn't notice. Closing one bank account, moving funds to another, contacting an old attorney friend under the guise of updating his will. Nothing drastic, nothing visible, just subtle shifts, like the earth before an earthquake. Through it all, Richard kept his face neutral, his voice calm when Kevin did call. He gave no sign of the storm building behind his eyes. He answered Kevin's few texts with bland replies, letting him believe the silence had broken the old man into submission. But it hadn't. The silence had done something else entirely. It had sharpened him. It had stripped away the illusions, leaving only clarity. He saw now that the boy he taught to drive, the boy who once smiled in the passenger seat, was gone. In his place stood a man who believed his father was weak, malleable, easy to manipulate. Richard leaned back one night in his chair, the photograph of Kevin at 16 on the desk beside him, and felt the hum of his own pulse. The silence had spoken louder than words. It had told him exactly who his son had become and exactly what needed to happen next. What Richard did after that would no longer be about hope or even anger. It would be about reclaiming what was his piece by piece, until Kevin understood that some bonds once broken can cut both ways. And the first cut was already coming. The sun was sinking low, casting amber streaks across the driveway when Richard pushed open the garage door. His hands were still damp from washing the dinner dishes, a quiet rhythm he had learned to fill the long hours. But the moment the door creaked open, his breath caught. The garage, once alive with the gleam of chrome and the comforting bulk of his car, yawned empty before him. The air smelled faintly of oil and polish, yet there was nothing to hold the scent in place. Bare concrete stretched where his sanctuary had been. His knees nearly buckled. For an instant he thought his eyes were betraying him. He rubbed them hard, blinked, even stepped back out, and in again, as though the car might reappear if he changed his angle. But the truth was stark. The car was gone. The silence inside the garage pressed against his chest, heavier than the walls themselves. He walked slowly, his footsteps echoing. His hand reached out to touch the workbench, as if it might steady him, then slid across the space where the car had stood, fingers brushing nothing but air. He crouched down and ran his palm over the cold concrete floor. There was still a faint outline where the tires had rested, darker patches where drips of oil had stained. That was all that remained, shadows of what had once been. Richard straightened and stood frozen for a long time, the ticking clock in the kitchen faint through the walls, the world outside moving as though nothing had changed. He whispered Margaret's name under his breath, his wife's memory colliding with the emptiness in front of him. That car had been theirs as much as it had been his. It carried the years of their lives, the moments when they were still young enough to believe in forever. And now it had vanished in an afternoon without so much as a trace. His mind began to turn, a grinding, reluctant churn of suspicion. He thought of Kevin, of Madison, of the questions they had asked with too much casualness. Do you really need it? Wouldn't it be better if... The words replayed like echoes, each one sharper now, each one tinged with betrayal. The silence Kevin had wrapped himself in suddenly had a purpose. This wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't neglect. It was prelude. Richard staggered back into the house, his heart hammering. He left the lights off and sat in the dark at the kitchen table, staring at his own reflection in the window. The man staring back was not just a father grieving the loss of a car. He was a man robbed of memory of dignity by the very blood he had once protected. The hours stretched. The phone on the counter remained silent until at last it buzzed. A message from Kevin. Short, flat. "Dad, we need to talk when I stop by later. Don't worry, it's for the best." Richard read it twice, the words slicing deeper each time. For the best. Whose best? Certainly not his. When Kevin finally arrived that night, the house seemed to shrink around them. He walked in with that careless air, not sheepish, not apologetic, just confident, like a man delivering news he thought would be met with reason. "I sold it," he said, his tone maddeningly casual. "It's gone, Dad. You weren't driving it anymore. It was just taking up space." Richard said nothing at first, his gaze locked on his son, studying him, dissecting the ease with which he spoke. Kevin's face carried no shame, no hesitation. It was as though he had erased the weight of history, the lessons learned in that very car, the night spent side by side in the garage. The silence stretched so long Kevin shifted uncomfortably, but he continued anyway. "We used the money for Madison's parents. They needed something special. A trip first class, the works. They've done so much for us, it only felt right." The words didn't just sting. They hollowed out something inside him. His son had sold the last piece of his life with Margaret, not to save his family, not to pay a debt, not even out of desperation. He had sold it for luxury, for appearances, for people who had never stood beside him through the storms. Richard's jaw tightened. He felt the rage, but it was not hot. It was cold, calculated, sliding into his veins like ice. He turned slowly toward the window, his voice low, almost too steady. "You had no right." Kevin exhaled, impatient. "Dad, don't be dramatic. You'll thank me. You can't keep clinging to the past. This way everyone benefits." "Everyone benefits." The phrase hung in the air like poison. Richard's hands curled into fists against his thighs, but he forced himself still. He would not give his son the satisfaction of a scene. Instead, he let the silence stretch again until Kevin grew restless and excused himself, promising they'd talk more later. When the door shut and the house swallowed the sound of his footsteps, Richard remained in his chair, staring into the night. His pulse slowed, steadied. He reached for a pad of paper and a pen from the counter drawer. His hand trembled only once before the first line etched itself across the page. Dates, figures, names. His mind clicked into place sharper than it had been in years. He was not broken. He was not defeated. The car was gone, but what Kevin had stolen was more than steel and chrome. He had stolen memory, pride, the tangible link to a life Richard had built with his own hands. And for that, there would be no forgiveness. There would only be reckoning. He folded the note and slid it into his pocket, his jaw set. The night stretched around him, heavy and quiet, but the silence no longer pressed. It charged the air like static before a storm. What Richard resolved in that moment was no longer about loss. It was about power. And what came next would not be an argument, not a plea, but a reminder that some fathers are far harder to erase than their sons ever imagine. Kevin appeared in the doorway as if nothing in the world had shifted his tie, loosened his phone still in hand, scrolling casually. He looked up with the same expression he wore when delivering the smallest news, as if this were no more important than telling his father the weather forecast. "I sold it," he said, his tone steady, unshaken. "You don't need it anymore." The words landed with the precision of a blade, cold and sharp, slicing through years of patience, sacrifice, and memory. Richard felt the floor tilt beneath him. He gripped the edge of the kitchen counter to steady himself, the air in his lungs thickening as though he were drowning in silence. The car was gone. That much he had seen with his own eyes. But hearing Kevin say it aloud with that calm indifference carved the wound deeper. It wasn't the sale itself that crushed him. It was the dismissal, the erasure of everything the car represented. It had not been steel and chrome. It had been decades of labor weekends spent with grease on his hands, nights spent saving every extra dollar to buy a part. It had been laughter in the garage, Margaret's smile in the passenger seat, the echo of Kevin's own teenage joy when he first learned how to handle a clutch. To Kevin now, it had been nothing more than a transaction, something to trade for comfort and applause from in-laws who had contributed nothing to the life Richard had built. His son's voice carried on each word another twist of the knife. Kevin explained where the money had gone, a trip for Madison's parents, a gesture of generosity dressed as duty. They needed it more than you, Dad. You wouldn't understand. It was just sitting there wasting space. He spoke without shame, without hesitation, without the smallest flicker of guilt. His eyes were clear, his jaw set. He believed he was right. Richard's vision blurred at the edges, the house seeming smaller, the walls pressing closer. He could hear Margaret's laughter in memory, that warm reminder of a life now desecrated by a son's arrogance. He wondered what she would have said if she had been standing there, how her disappointment would have radiated in silence heavier than any rebuke. For a moment he nearly spoke her name aloud, but the word died in his throat. Instead he stared at Kevin, letting the silence drag long enough to cut. His son shifted slightly, impatience flashing in his eyes. Richard finally spoke, his voice low, steady, devoid of rage but burning with something far colder. You sold my life's work, and you did it with a smile. Kevin rolled his eyes, a gesture that carried all the contempt of a teenager but in the body of a grown man. Dad, don't make this dramatic. You don't drive it. You don't need it. Madison's parents have done so much for us. It was the right thing to do. The right thing. The phrase echoed in Richard's head like a cruel joke. He thought of the countless nights he had worked double shifts, the years of exhaustion he had carried on his shoulders, all so his son could have opportunities others only dreamed of. He thought of the braces, the tuition the first car Kevin ever drove bought with money scraped together from his father's savings. Was that the right thing, too? Did Kevin even remember? The silence stretched again, but this time Richard chose it. He let it suffocate the room, let it weigh on his son, until Kevin's bravado faltered. Richard's eyes did not waver. He wanted Kevin to feel it, to understand the magnitude of what he had done, though deep down he knew he never would. When Kevin finally left, the echo of the door shutting reverberated through the house like a final verdict. Richard stood motionless, staring at the empty hallway. His chest rose and fell with slow, deliberate breaths. Rage trembled beneath his skin, but it was not the kind that exploded. It was the kind that froze, that sharpened, that waited. Later in his study, Richard poured himself a drink and sat in the dark. The bourbon burned as it went down, anchoring him to the moment. He set the glass aside and leaned back, the leather of the chair creaking under his weight. On the desk lay an old photograph of Kevin as a boy, grease on his hands, a smile too big for his face. Richard stared at it until the image blurred, then set it face down. That boy was gone. In his place stood a man who believed his father's treasures were disposable, who believed love and loyalty could be measured in dollars. Richard opened a drawer and pulled out a pad of paper. He wrote slowly, deliberately, his pen scratching across the page. He listed names, people he trusted, people Kevin had forgotten, his father still knew. He listed dates, deadlines, anniversaries, numbers that mattered. He listed accounts, assets Kevin had no idea existed. With each stroke of the pen, the weight in his chest shifted, not lighter but sharper. This wasn't grief anymore. It was design. The night deepened, the house silent except for the sound of his pen and the occasional clink of ice in the glass. Outside, the wind rattled the branches against the window, a restless whisper that matched the storm gathering in his mind. Richard folded the paper neatly and placed it in a drawer, locking it with a small key. He sat back, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the glass, and whispered words Kevin would never hear until it was too late. You think I'm finished, but I've only begun. What came next would not be immediate, nor would it be loud. It would be quiet, deliberate, a mirror of the betrayal he had suffered. Kevin believed he had erased his father with a sail, with a shrug, with a smile. He was wrong. The car was gone, but the reckoning had only just arrived. And when it unfolded, Kevin would learn that some fathers do not break. They build. And when they build revenge, it lasts longer than steel. Richard sat there, the words echoing in his mind like the relentless toll of a bell he couldn't silence. The car. The single object he had poured his soul into wasn't exchanged to cover an emergency, wasn't sold to rescue his son from ruin, wasn't even gone for something as mundane as bills. No, the money had been squandered on a vacation, a luxury escape for Madison's parents. People who had never spent a single night in that garage, who had never known the weight of the sacrifices he had carried. First-class tickets, lavish hotels, champagne on balconies overlooking oceans he himself had never seen, that was the price of his memories. He felt the humiliation settle in his chest like a stone, its weight suffocating. He pictured them boarding the plane, Gerald with his polished shoes, Patricia with her smug smile, Madison by their side, all of them thanking Kevin for his generosity. Generosity with what his father's life's work, his father's history. The audacity of it made Richard's hands tremble, though his face remained as still as stone. Rage curled through him, but it wasn't the kind that erupted in shouts or slammed fists. It was colder, quieter, like frost spreading across glass. He didn't need to shout. The silence itself was sharper than any words. He poured himself another bourbon, the amber liquid catching the light from the lamp in the study. He stared at the glass before drinking, imagining each swallow burning away the edges of his restraint. He wanted to storm out to drag Kevin back into that garage and force him to see what he had destroyed. But he didn't. He stayed seated because Richard understood something Kevin did not. Power wasn't in the outburst. Power was in control. And right now control was his only weapon. The humiliation twisted into memory. He thought back to the years when Madison's parents had barely acknowledged him. Holiday dinners where his presence was tolerated more than welcomed conversations, where he was spoken to as though he were an outdated relic. They saw him as the old man in the corner, the one whose stories dragged on, whose usefulness had expired. And now they were clinking glasses on a balcony halfway around the world, celebrating with the very money his son had stolen from him. Richard set the glass down, his jaw tight, his reflection staring back at him in the window pane. He no longer saw himself as a man beaten down by grief and betrayal. He saw a man sharpening. He began to write again, this time not just notes but strategy. Contacts who owed him favors, business acquaintances from years past, even old friends in banking and real estate. He remembered every deal he had made, every handshake that had bound men to their word. Kevin thought his father's world had ended with retirement, with Margaret's death, with the quiet loneliness of an old house. He had no idea that Richard's reach extended further than he ever imagined. He thought of the house paid off years ago, a fact Kevin had conveniently forgotten. He thought of the accounts Kevin didn't know existed, funds Margaret had quietly tucked away, assets that had never been spoken of aloud. He thought of the documents locked in drawers, titles, deeds, investments. Kevin believed the car was the last piece of value his father had left. How wrong he was. The rage turned sharper as Richard remembered the way Kevin had said it, calm, dismissive, as if disposing of a trinket. "You don't need it anymore." It wasn't just disrespect. It was erasure, a deliberate stripping away of his father's identity, as though age had made him disposable. Richard pressed his hand against the desk, steadying himself, his nails biting into the wood. He felt his heartbeat slow, his breathing level. The humiliation was no longer a weight. It was fuel. Later that night, as the wind rattled the windows and the house groaned with the shifting air, Richard stood in the garage staring at the empty space. He imagined the car still there. Imagined Margaret leaning against the hood, laughing at his frustration over a stubborn bolt. He let the memory anchor him, not to the past but to the promise of what was to come. He whispered into the emptiness, "They think they've won. They don't know me." The next morning, Kevin called again, his voice casual, as though nothing monumental had happened. He spoke about how happy Madison's parents were, about how they deserved the trip, about how it was time for his father to let go of old attachments. Richard listened in silence, the corners of his mouth tightening into something that wasn't quite a smile. He gave no hint of what was moving inside him, no crack in the calm. When Kevin ended the call, Richard simply placed the phone down and reached for his pen again. The days that followed were quiet on the surface. Richard moved through his routine's morning coffee, the walk to the mailbox evenings in his study. But beneath that quiet he was building. Calls made discreetly, files pulled from drawers, accounts shifted. Each step small, invisible to Kevin, but each one part of a growing storm. He replayed every word Kevin had said, not to wound himself further, but to sharpen the edge of what was coming. And at night, when he lay awake in the stillness of his room, Richard no longer felt crushed by grief. He felt anticipation. The humiliation had passed through him, the anger had burned into clarity, and what remained was resolve. He would not confront Kevin with rage or accusation. He would let his son walk blindly forward, convinced his father was weak, convinced he had erased the last of his worth. Because when the reckoning came, it would not be loud. It would not be frantic. It would arrive like a shadow across Kevin's world, precise and devastating. Richard knew that Madison's parents would enjoy their trip, that Kevin would bask in their gratitude, that they would all return to their lives smug and satisfied. But they had made one fatal mistake. They believed the old man was finished. What came next would prove just how wrong they were. Richard sat in the dim light of his study, the silence around him deeper than the night pressing against the windows. The photograph of Kevin as a boy still lay face down on the desk, a deliberate act of burial. That boy no longer existed. In his place stood a man who had cut into the core of his father's trust and left it bleeding. What had once been pride had curdled into betrayal, and not the kind time could soften. It was the kind that reshaped a man, that stripped away illusions and left only steel beneath the skin. He replayed the years in his mind, not as fond memories anymore, but as evidence. Every late shift he had worked, every sacrifice Margaret had made, every dollar they had scraped together, it had all gone into Kevin's future. Richard had believed that love was enough, that devotion guaranteed loyalty. But now he saw the flaw. He had mistaken gratitude for permanence, when in truth gratitude could be erased the moment convenience came calling. Kevin's betrayal wasn't sudden. It was the result of years of small erasures, each one overlooked in the name of keeping peace. The silence, the dismissive remarks, the growing distance, every sign had been there, and Richard had chosen to blind himself. But blindness was over now. He saw his son clearly, not as family, but as a man who had taken what wasn't his and done it without hesitation. That clarity was its own kind of fire, slow-burning and relentless. Richard did not yell. He did not confront. He let the fury coil inside him, shaping it into something sharper, more useful. Anger spent recklessly was waste. Anger honed became power. He poured himself a drink and moved through the house, his footsteps steady, his mind sharper with every step. The walls that once felt suffocating now felt like witnesses. He paused in the garage, staring at the empty concrete floor. He traced the outline where the car had rested with his eyes, as if the ghost of it were still there. He whispered into the hollow space, not to Kevin, not even to himself, but to Margaret's memory. He thinks he's ended me. He doesn't know what he's begun. The betrayal had created a fracture, but fractures could be used. Richard began to think differently about everything, his assets, his connections, the leverage he still held. He started small. Old folders pulled from drawers, documents spread across his desk, a phone call to a lawyer he hadn't spoken to in a decade. He checked accounts Kevin didn't know existed, assets tucked away that Margaret had insisted they never mention to anyone, not even family. Richard had agreed out of caution, never realizing those hidden reserves would become his shield. At night, when the world slept, he stayed awake, writing notes in careful lines, drawing arrows, building a map of what was his and what Kevin thought he controlled. His handwriting was tight, disciplined, the way it had been when he managed construction projects years ago. He worked the same way now, not with blueprints for buildings, but with a blueprint for dismantling illusions. Kevin had mistaken his father's grief for weakness, his silence for surrender. That miscalculation would cost him. He began to observe Kevin with new eyes. When Kevin spoke on the phone, Richard listened for the hesitations, the small tells in his voice. When Madison sent messages, he noticed the phrasing, the way she framed every decision as if it were theirs together, when in truth she steered every choice. He saw now that Kevin wasn't just careless. He was lead-molded, reshaped into a version of himself that Madison's family could use. But that didn't absolve him. If anything, it made the betrayal worse. A son who could be bent so easily against his own blood was no son at all. Richard kept his face calm whenever they crossed paths. He gave Kevin nothing to suspect, no crack in the mask. He nodded when expected, spoke briefly, allowed the impression of compliance to linger. Inside, though, he catalogued every word, every action, every opportunity. The anger inside him wasn't boiling anymore. It was sharpening, cooling into a blade that would cut when the time was right. The days blurred into a rhythm of quiet preparation. Coffee in the morning, a walk through the neighborhood to keep his body strong, then hours in the study with his notes. He made phone calls discreetly, sometimes stepping outside to avoid the possibility of being overheard. Old friends were surprised to hear from him, but most still remembered the respect his name carried. A favor asked here, a detail confirmed there, and slowly the foundation of something larger began to take shape. In the evenings, Richard sat in the silence of the house and let the weight of betrayal fuel him. The pain was still there, sharp as ever, but it no longer paralyzed him. It propelled him. He no longer saw Kevin as the boy he raised, but as the man who had crossed a line that could never be uncrossed. Trust, once broken this way, was gone forever. And yet Richard knew this wasn't the end of the story. Kevin believed the car was gone and the matter finished. Madison's parents were sipping wine in Europe, raising toasts to their fortune. Kevin was basking in their approval, convinced he had acted decisively, even heroically. But none of them saw the storm building in the silence they mistook for surrender. Richard leaned back in his chair one night, the faint hum of the refrigerator down the hall the only sound. He clasped his hands together, his knuckles white, and allowed himself the smallest smile, cold and deliberate. The betrayal had cut him deeply, yes, but it had also freed him. There was no going back, no patching over the wound, no hope of reconciliation. That chapter had ended. What came next would be something else entirely. It would be the beginning of a reckoning Kevin never saw coming, the kind of reckoning that would not only balance the scales, but tip them so violently that he would never forget. The son had betrayed the father. Now the father would show the son what betrayal truly cost. He did not shout. He did not slam doors or fling accusations into the empty rooms. Richard folded his hands on the kitchen table and let the house keep its noise, an old radiator coughing the distant click of a neighbor's TV. Inside that quiet, something colder and more certain took root. The hurt that had clenched his chest loosened into a meticulous purpose. This would not be a fit of fury. It would be a patient, unavoidable correction. If Kevin had chosen to treat his life as expendable, then Richard would answer in a language Kevin understood: consequence. First he catalogued. He moved like a man converting grief into facts, turning feeling into a ledger. There were the obvious things: the empty concrete slab in the garage, the missing registration documents, a blank space on the insurance policy. But there were other things Kevin had never imagined: accounts opened years ago in joint names and then quietly separated when Margaret worried about creditors, trust instruments tucked into folders, labeled with initials no one but Richard could decipher, insurance riders no one read, and a small portfolio of dividend-bearing assets that paid well but had never been flaunted. Margaret had always insisted on discretion. She had liked the security of quiet numbers. Richard now realized that discretion was armor. He began making calls at odd hours. His voice was steady, the kind that cut through voicemail systems and into human attention. To an old attorney in the city he said only, "I need to review estate documents." arrange a meeting. To a bank manager with a name that still carried weight, he asked for a verification of account activity. Flagged transfers, anything out of the ordinary. To an ex-colleague who remembered the loyalty of hands shaken on deals decades ago, he left a single sentence that required zero explanation. "I might need a favor." When the answers came back, they did so with the slow inevitability of an inspector's report. Old accounts contained details that painted a different picture of the family's finances. Transfers had been made, patterns emerged. While the legal scaffolding took shape, Richard set another part of his plan into motion. He watched, not in the petty way of spying through curtains, but as a surgeon studies a body before incision. He kept receipts and noted times. He let Kevin think the house had hollowed him out the way his silence had once misled him. Kevin called less guardedly, made mentions of trips and in-law obligations. Madison posted photos on social media, gleaming resorts, cocktails at sunset, its glossy surface inviting compliments. Richard observed the comments and the tags. He traced the travel agencies, the agent who favored first-class upgrades, the boutique seller of last-minute packages that accepted wire transfers. None of this was accidental. Then he followed the money trail himself. A payment to a private seller, a transaction routed through a broker in a city abroad, a deposit linked to a collection that traded in vintage cars. That was the lead he had hoped for. The sale had been fast, opportunistic, exactly the impulsive move of someone juggling appearances and debt. He made a call to a German dealer who specialized in rare restorations and listened as the man on the other end, curt and professional, confirmed a purchase, a midnight blue convertible recently acquired. The dealer thought he had completed a clean sale. He had not met the owner. He had not read the backstory. He had simply paid money for metal and horsepower. He had no idea of the consequence of letting that metal pass through his hands. Richard engaged an investigator discreetly, a woman with a reputation for tracing things that others called lost. She moved with quiet efficiency, opening documents in foreign registries, contacting collectors and mapping the car's path from driveway to showroom. Within days, she could tell him where the car had crossed a border, which transport company had handled the crate, which collector's phone number was associated with the final lead. The language of recovery was procedural dry, but it offered leverage. If the car could not be recovered outright, she said, ownership disputes and proof of unauthorized sale opened avenues. A forged signature, a hurried title transfer. These were mistakes that lawyers liked to unravel. At the same time, Richard prepared for the public front. Kevin had already made a misstep. He had bragged to a cousin about the favor for his in-laws. That cousin had not kept the confidence Richard needed. Social threads spread. News once set loose could be dangerous for a family business if it painted the patriarch as absent or outmaneuvered by his own blood. Richard called an old PR associate, not to spin a story of victimhood, but to craft a narrative that made the corporate angle unavoidable, an inquiry into governance, a demonstration of swift corrective steps taken by a responsible board. He would not be the man sobbing in ink-stained op-eds. He would be the steward protecting a legacy. The statement would pivot attention away from family drama and toward fiduciary duty. It would be cold, factual, and unassailable. He also thought of Kevin's weakness, ego. In quieter days, he had watched the son feed it. Instagram likes cocktail conversations, the gentle praise of people who mistook boldness for substance. Ego could be manipulated. Richard let small things leak. A whisper to a mutual acquaintance about an upcoming routine audit, a casual mention to a banker that certain transfers looked irregular. Rumors do not need logos to gain traction. They only need plausible seams to grab. Kevin, convinced of his immunity, would likely react. He always had. Between these legal and reputational moves, Richard placed a human element. He reached out to Harriet, a woman his and Margaret's age, who had once been a friend of the family and now lived a life of half-remembered favors and timely loyalty. He needed someone who understood both Kevin's world and his own. Someone who could call without seeming to call, who could attend brunches and ask the right questions about who had been handling payments or why certain repairs had been scheduled. Harriet's social graces masked an acuity that made her useful. She would, if needed, ask Kevin the kind of question that would unsettle a man who relied on performance. "Are you sure all these expenditures are necessary?" As Richard threaded these instruments into place, he did not forget the human calculus. He imagined the faces that would return from Europe. Madison and her parents flushed from vacation, Kevin smug with the assumed moral high ground. He imagined the first moment they would realize that the appearance of victory had frayed. Perhaps it would be the sudden freezing of a credit line, a request for clarification from a bank about a transfer, or a polite but firm letter from his lawyer demanding details about the provenance of a car sold without consent. Perhaps it would be a call from a collector in Europe who had invested good money only to find civil litigation tied to the vehicle. The shock would not need to be theatrical. It only needed to be precise and unavoidable. He spent nights crafting contingencies. If Kevin pulled back, Richard's lawyer would escalate. If Kevin went public to smear him, the PR would frame the narrative in the language of governance and fiduciary responsibility. If Kevin panicked and tried to move assets, Richard had documentation and signatures that would complicate such efforts. The old man who had once believed that patience and sacrifice would secure his son now relied on the patient surgical removal of privilege. Yet in the center of all these plans, a softer motivation lingered, one Richard rarely admitted even to himself. He did not seek ruin for his son. He wanted a reset, a break that would force responsibility into the life Kevin had remade without asking. He wanted his grandson to grow up with a family that had boundaries and accountability, not perpetual rescue. He wanted in a measured way for Kevin to understand that entitlement calcifies into loss, unless tested and corrected. The first moves were tiny, almost invisible: an automated transfer frozen for review, an account flagged, an overseas dealer contacted. But small disturbances gather force. What began as a private recalibration would, if his little machine of leverage worked, cascade outward until there was no hiding from the cost of betrayal. Richard closed his ledger and slid it into a drawer. He powered down the kitchen light and stood for a long moment at the window, watching the street lamps blink awake. The house no longer felt like a mausoleum. It felt like a command center. He had turned mourning into method. He had converted humiliation into a framework for consequence. He touched the photograph of Margaret one last time and whispered not a prayer, but a promise. The next day would be ordinary in the eyes of the world, but it would carry the seeds of change. Kevin believed he had erased his father with a sail and a shrug. He was wrong. The quiet resentment that had lain dormant had become an architecture of retribution, and once built, it would not soon be dismantled. What Richard set in motion now would move with the steady certainty of legal deadlines and bank protocols of people who did their jobs by habit and by law. The first domino would fall before long, but the outcome would not be a spectacle. It would be an unraveling threaded through contract statements and the patient precision of a man who remembered how to build things that last. The question was not whether Kevin would pay. The question was how much he would understand before it was too late. Life has a way of testing the bonds we think are unbreakable. Richard's story is a powerful reminder that trust once betrayed leaves scars that run deeper than material loss. His car wasn't just metal and paint. It was memory, effort, and love woven into something tangible. When his son sold it for luxury, the act revealed how easily respect can be replaced by selfishness. For older generations, the lesson strikes close. Our sacrifices should not be taken for granted, and silence is not weakness. Sometimes dignity means knowing when to stop pleading for recognition and instead stand firm in self-respect. It also shows the importance of safeguarding what we build, not only through love and hope, but with wisdom and foresight. Family loyalty is priceless, but it must be earned, not assumed. As we grow older, we carry both wisdom and strength, and no betrayal can erase that. If this story resonates with you, don't forget to subscribe and share your thoughts in the comments. Your voice matters, and your experiences can inspire others.